The spring breeze gently rustled through the maple trees in Central Park as Sarah Chen sat cross-legged on her favorite wooden bench. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-maintained grass, and the 16-year-old was lost in her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She had been coming to this same spot every Tuesday and Thursday after school for the past 2 years, finding peace in the quiet corner of the park. Sarah tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear and adjusted her blue school backpack beside her. She wore her usual after-school outfit, jeans, a light purple sweater, and white sneakers. Other park visitors walked their dogs or jogged along the paths, paying no attention to the teenager absorbed in her book. Officer James Miller was having a different kind of day. Recently transferred from a tough precinct in the city's south side, he found the peaceful northern suburbs almost too quiet. 6 weeks into his new assignment, he was eager to prove himself to his new department. His polished badge caught the sunlight as he walked through the park, scanning the area with suspicious eyes. Miller noticed Sarah sitting alone and immediately began making assumptions. The park was in an upscale neighborhood, and in his mind, she didn't fit his image of a local resident. He adjusted his belt, straightened his back, and walked toward her with heavy steps. "What are you doing here?" Officer Miller's sharp voice cut through Sarah's reading concentration. She looked up, startled by his sudden presence and harsh tone. "I'm just reading, sir," Sarah replied politely, holding up her book to show him. Her father had always taught her to be respectful to law enforcement, though something about this officer's approach made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "This is a restricted area after school hours," Miller lied, knowing full well there was no such rule. He stood uncomfortably close to the bench, his hand resting on his belt near his taser. "Let me see some ID." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her school bag. "I don't understand, officer. I come here all the time. There's no sign about restrictions, and other people are using the park too." She gestured to a couple walking their golden retriever merely 50 feet away. "Don't get smart with me," Miller snapped, his face hardening. "Where do you live? Who are your parents? You don't look like you're from around here." A small group of park visitors had begun to notice the interaction. Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman who frequently fed the pigeons, stopped and watched with concern. 2 joggers slowed their pace, one of them discreetly pulling out a phone to record. Sarah's heart raced, but she maintained her composure, just as her father had taught her. "I live on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from here. My father is—" She paused, considering whether to mention her dad's position but decided against it. "My parents have lived here for 12 years. Officer Miller scoffed. "Maple Street, that's the most expensive street in the district. Now I know you're lying." He pulled out his notepad, his pen scratching against the paper as he wrote. "Stand up. Hands where I can see them." More people had gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, who owned the local bakery and had known Sarah since she was a little girl. Maria recognized both Sarah and the increasingly aggressive behavior of the officer. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone. "This isn't right," Maria whispered to herself as she dialed the police department's non-emergency number. She had attended enough community meetings to know the proper channels for reporting officer misconduct. Sarah stood slowly, her book falling to the ground. Her legs felt weak, but her father's voice echoed in her head. "Always stay calm, speak clearly, and know your rights." She took a deep breath and said firmly, "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm a minor, and I'd like to call my parents." Officer Miller laughed dismissively. "Oh, we'll call your parents all right. Right after we verify who you really are and what you're doing in this neighborhood." He reached for his radio, completely unaware that the call he was about to make would lead straight to his own boss, Police Chief David Chen, Sarah's father. The sun continued its descent behind the trees, casting longer shadows across the park, as the situation teetered on the edge of a revelation that would shake the entire police department to its core. The growing crowd of onlookers made Officer Miller more aggressive rather than cautious. His face reddened as he noticed more phones recording the incident. To him, this was no longer just about questioning a suspicious person. Now it was about maintaining his authority in public. "Put your hands on the bench," he ordered Sarah, his voice growing louder. "Spread your feet apart." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Officer, please. I'm just reading in the park. Look at my student ID." She reached slowly for her school bag again, but Miller's sharp voice stopped her. "Don't move," he shouted, causing several nearby birds to scatter from their perches. "I didn't give you permission to reach for anything. That bag could contain drugs or weapons." A mother quickly ushered her young children away from the scene, while others moved closer, their phones recording every moment. The afternoon had turned into an unsettling spectacle, with Sarah unwillingly playing the leading role. Maria Rodriguez, still on the phone with the police department, spoke urgently but clearly. "Yes, this is happening right now in Central Park, near the east entrance. The officer is targeting a young Asian girl who's done nothing wrong. She's just a student. I know her family." Meanwhile, Sarah tried to stay calm despite her racing heart. She remembered the family dinner last week when her father had discussed proper police conduct. "An officer must have reasonable suspicion to detain someone," he had explained. "Simply being in a public place is not suspicious activity." "Officer," Sarah said, her voice trembling but clear, "what crime do you suspect me of committing? I have the right to know why I'm being detained." Miller's expression darkened at her question. "Oh, so now you're a lawyer too?" He stepped even closer, trying to intimidate her. "Let me tell you something. I've been dealing with troublemakers for 15 years. I know when someone doesn't belong." Two elderly men sitting at a nearby chess table stood up in protest. "Leave her alone," one of them called out. "She's here every week, reading her books." "Stay out of this," Miller warned the men, his hand now resting on his weapon. "This is police business. Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The sky had turned a deep orange, and the park's shadows grew longer, making the scene feel even more dramatic. Maria had finally reached someone important at the police department. "Listen carefully," she said into her phone, her voice urgent. "The officer is getting more aggressive. The girl's name is Sarah, Sarah Chen. Yes, like Chief Chen. Wait. Oh my God, is she?" The realization hit Maria like a thunderbolt. All these years, she had known Sarah as a customer at her bakery, but she had never made the connection to the chief. Now it all made sense. The polite demeanor, the quiet confidence, and the familiar features she shared with the department's respected leader. Officer Miller, oblivious to this revelation, continued his harassment. Last chance, he barked at Sarah. "Either you admit what you're really doing here, or you're coming down to the station." Sarah straightened her back, gathering every ounce of courage she had. "Officer Miller," she said, reading his nameplate for the first time, "I want to speak to your supervisor." "Now." A small smile of satisfaction crossed Miller's face. "Oh, you want my supervisor? Perfect. Let me call this in." He reached for his radio, ready to report an uncooperative suspect. Just then, two police cars pulled into the park entrance, their lights flashing but sirens silent. Miller grinned, assuming they were responding to his earlier call for backup. But Sarah recognized the unmarked car in the lead. It was from Internal Affairs, her father's most trusted department. The sun had almost set completely now, and the park's lights were flickering on one by one. Officer Miller stood in their glow, still unaware that his next few actions would not only end his career, but would spark a change throughout the entire police force. The truth about Sarah's identity was about to explode like a bomb, and Miller had lit the fuse himself. Maria Rodriguez watched the Internal Affairs cars pull up, her phone still pressed to her ear. Her heart pounded as she saw Captain Lisa Torres step out of the lead vehicle. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Torres. She was Chief Chen's most trusted investigator and had zero tolerance for police misconduct. "What's going on here?" Captain Torres's strong voice cut through the evening air. She walked purposefully toward Officer Miller and Sarah, her badge gleaming under the park lights. Officer Miller straightened his uniform, clearly surprised by Internal Affairs' presence. "Captain, I'm handling a suspicious person situation. This girl doesn't belong." "Doesn't belong?" A new voice interrupted. It was Mr. Thompson, a high school physics teacher, stepping forward from the crowd. "That's Sarah Chen. She's one of my best students. She sits right here every Tuesday and Thursday, doing her homework and reading." Miller's face twitched with annoyance. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." But more witnesses were finding their courage. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who fed the pigeons, hobbled forward with her cane. "I've watched this sweet girl grow up in this park. She helps me carry my groceries every Sunday after church." Captain Torres pulled out her notepad, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. "How long has this interaction been going on?" she asked the crowd. 23 minutes, answered a young man holding up his phone. "I've been recording since he first approached her." The officer lied about park rules and refused to listen to her explanations. Miller's confidence began to crack. "Captain, these civilians don't understand police work. This is a high-end area, and we need to be vigilant about." "About what exactly, Officer Miller?" Torres's voice was sharp. "About young people reading books in public parks? About students studying in their own neighborhood?" Sarah remained standing quietly, her book still on the ground where it had fallen. She watched as more neighbors stepped forward, each with a story about knowing her family. "She volunteers at my library every Saturday," said Miss Patel, the local librarian. "Such a responsible young lady. Last month, she helped organize a fundraiser for our youth center," added Pastor Brown, "raised over $3,000. Captain Torres turned to Sarah. "Miss, I'd apologize for this situation. Are you all right?" Before Sarah could answer, Officer Miller tried one last time to assert his authority. "Captain, with all due respect, I was conducting a legitimate investigation. She just shown her ID." "She's 16, Miller." Maria finally burst out, unable to contain herself any longer. "She's a minor, and do you even know who her father is?" Torres shot Maria a warning look. She wanted this handled properly, not through intimidation, but the damage was done. Officer Miller's face showed the first signs of uncertainty. "Her father?" he asked, his voice losing its edge. Sarah took a deep breath. She hadn't wanted to use her father's position, had wanted to handle this situation on her own merits. But now, with so many people supporting her, she felt stronger. "My father," she said clearly, "is Police Chief David Chen." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Miller's face went from red to pale in seconds. He looked at his radio, then at Captain Torres, then back at Sarah, seeing her features in a new light. The same determined chin as the chief, the same steady gaze. I didn't." Miller stammered, but Torres cut him off. "Officer Miller, step away from Miss Chen immediately." Torres's voice was cold. "Report to my vehicle. We'll discuss this incident in detail at headquarters." As Miller walked away, his shoulders slumped, more neighbors gathered around Sarah. Maria brought her the fallen book, now slightly dirty from the ground. Mr. Thompson offered her a bottle of water. Mrs. Wilson patted her hand gently. Captain Torres was already organizing the witnesses, collecting contact information and statements. The park lights shone brightly now, illuminating a scene very different from the one that had started an hour ago. What began as one officer's prejudiced harassment had transformed into a powerful display of community solidarity. And somewhere across town, in the chief's office, a phone was about to ring with news that would change the department forever. Police Chief David Chen sat in his office, reviewing reports about community policing initiatives. The wall behind his desk displayed 25 years of service awards and community appreciation plaques. A small frame held a recent photo of him and Sarah at her science fair, both beaming with pride. His intercom buzzed. "Chief." His secretary's voice was unusually tense. "There's an urgent call from Captain Torres." Chen picked up the phone immediately. Torres never called without good reason. "Torres, what's the situation?" As he listened to the captain's report, his face remained professionally calm, but his free hand gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. His daughter, his Sarah, the very thing he'd fought against throughout his career, was happening to his own child. "I understand," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Continue gathering statements. I'll handle this through proper channels." He placed the phone down gently, though part of him wanted to slam it. Deputy Chief Williams entered his office, having overheard parts of the conversation. "David, I heard about Sarah. Want me to head down there?" Chen stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city he'd sworn to protect. "No, Mark. We do this by the book. No special treatment, no rushed judgment." He turned to face his old friend. "That's what makes us different from officers like Miller." "The press will be all over this," Williams warned. Chief's daughter racially profiled by one of our own officers? It's going to be big. Then we make it count, Chen replied, pulling out a thick folder from his cabinet. Remember that reform proposal we've been working on? About additional training and community oversight. This just became our catalyst for change. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his wife, Linda. David, I just heard from Sarah. Are you going down to the park? Chen closed his eyes briefly. No, honey, I'm sending internal affairs. Sarah needs to know we trust her to handle this, and the department needs to see this handled properly, not as a father's revenge. She's just 16, David. Linda's voice cracked slightly. And she's stronger than we know, Chen replied, remembering how Sarah had stayed calm and followed procedure, just as they taught her. Is she coming home now? Captain Torres is having an officer drive her home. A female officer, Linda added quickly. Chen nodded to himself. Torres always thought of details like that. He looked at his calendar, at the community meeting scheduled for next week. It would need a new agenda now. Deputy Williams watched his friend closely. What's our next move, Chief? Chen sat back down at his desk and began typing on his computer. First, we review Miller's entire record. I want everything: complaints, commendations, training reports. Second, we call an emergency meeting with the police commission. Third, we prepare a public statement, transparent but by the book. And unofficially? Williams asked quietly. Chen paused his typing. Unofficially, we make sure every officer in this department understands that what happened today isn't just about my daughter. It's about every kid who looks suspicious for reading in a park. Every person who doesn't belong in their own neighborhood. His computer chimed with an incoming email. The first witness statements from the park, including videos. Chen opened them, but couldn't bring himself to watch yet. Instead, he pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began writing. I'm drafting new department protocols, he explained to Williams. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training, weekly community engagement requirements, civilian oversight committees with real power. His pen moved quickly across the paper. Miller didn't just harass my daughter today. He gave us the push we needed to fix a broken system. The office fell quiet except for the scratch of Chen's pen. Outside his window, the city lights began twinkling in the growing darkness. On his desk, the photo of Sarah reminded him of everything at stake, not just his daughter's safety, but the future of his department and his city. Tomorrow, the media circus would begin. Questions would be asked, decisions would be challenged. But tonight, Chief Chen would do what he'd always done, work to make his city better, one policy at a time, and somewhere across town, his daughter was showing the same quiet strength, turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for change. Officer James Miller sat in the back of Captain Torres's unmarked police car, his mind racing as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The car's interior felt suffocating as Torres drove them toward police headquarters. Every few minutes, he glanced at his phone, which kept buzzing with notifications from social media where videos of the incident were already spreading. I didn't know, he muttered for the third time. How was I supposed to know she was the chief's daughter? Captain Torres pulled the car to a sudden stop at a red light and turned to face him. That's exactly the problem, Miller. It shouldn't matter whose daughter she is. Would your actions have been acceptable if she were anyone else's child? Miller fell silent, remembering his own words. You don't look like you belong here. They sounded different in his head now, ugly and unprofessional. Back at the park, Sarah sat on a different bench, surrounded by supportive neighbors. Officer Jenny Martinez, assigned by Torres to take her statement, sat beside her with a notepad. Take your time, Martinez said gently. Just tell me everything that happened from the beginning. Sarah's hands had stopped shaking now. The same neighbors who had walked past her reading every week were now bringing her water, offering encouragement, and sharing their own recordings of the incident with Officer Martinez. You know what's funny? Sarah said, looking at her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that Mrs. Wilson had cleaned off for her. We're studying prejudice in literature class. I never thought I'd become a real-life example. At police headquarters, news of the incident spread quickly through the building. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the situation in hushed tones. Many had worked with Miller since his transfer, but few had seen his prejudiced side so clearly displayed. Sergeant Peterson, who had trained Miller when he first arrived, sat at his desk reviewing the footage from the park. All these years of community outreach, he said to his partner, and this knucklehead ruins it in 20 minutes. In the Internal Affairs office, Captain Torres led Miller to an interview room. The walls were bare except for a department conduct poster, one that Chief Chen had updated last year to emphasize community trust. "Sit down, Officer Miller," Torres commanded, placing a voice recorder on the table. "Let's talk about what happened in the park today, and your history of similar incidents at your previous precinct." Miller's head snapped up. "My previous precinct? What do you mean?" Torres opened a folder she'd received from Deputy Williams. 3 complaints of racial profiling in the last 2 years, all conveniently buried in administrative paperwork. Did you think we wouldn't find them? Outside the interview room, Deputy Chief Williams watched through the one-way glass. His phone buzzed. A message from Chief Chen. "How's he holding up?" Williams typed back, realizing his career just imploded. "Torres is handling it." In the Chen household, Linda Chen helped Sarah hang up her jacket as they arrived home. "Dad's going to handle this properly," she assured her daughter. "No shortcuts, no special treatment." Sarah nodded, understanding the importance of following proper procedures. "I kept thinking about what Dad always says about power and responsibility. Officer Miller had power today, but he didn't have any responsibility." The evening news was already running the story. Local police officer accuses police chief's daughter of suspicious activity in park. Phone calls from reporters flooded the police department's press office. Meanwhile, Maria Rodriguez had returned to her bakery, where she found herself surrounded by customers eager to discuss what they'd witnessed. "That's what happens when you judge people by how they look," she told them, putting fresh muffins in the display case. "But you should have seen Sarah, so brave, so composed, just like her father." At headquarters, Miller sat alone in the interview room during a break, his badge and gun already surrendered to Torres. On the table, his phone showed a text from his former captain. "Heard what happened. Can't help you this time." The day's last light faded from the windows as the department hummed with activity. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, official statements, and hard questions about police conduct. But tonight, in interview rooms and offices, homes and bakeries across the city, people were already learning the lesson that Officer Miller had learned too late. Justice doesn't care about appearances, and dignity doesn't belong to any one color or neighborhood. The next morning, Detective Sandra Reeves sat at her desk in Internal Affairs, surrounded by stacks of files. As the department's most thorough investigator, she had been personally selected by Captain Torres to dig into Officer Miller's past. Her computer screen showed emails from his previous precinct, each one revealing a troubling pattern. "Captain, you need to see this," Reeves called out, pointing to her screen. Miller had 5 complaints in his old precinct, not 3. 2 were hidden in separate files marked as training incidents. Torres leaned over to look at the evidence. The complaints showed a clear pattern: young people of color questioned without cause, aggressive behavior during routine stops, and paperwork that mysteriously disappeared. "Keep digging," Torres ordered. "I want every detail from his academy days forward." In another part of the building, Officer Jenny Martinez was interviewing Miller's former partners. The small interview room felt tense as Officer Thompson, Miller's partner from 2 months ago, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look," Thompson said, running his hand through his gray hair, "I requested a different partner after 2 weeks with Miller. The way he treated people in certain neighborhoods, it wasn't right. But I didn't file a formal complaint. Maybe I should have." Martinez wrote everything down, remembering Sarah's calm face from yesterday. "Why didn't you report it?" Thompson looked at his hands. "You know how it is. Nobody wants to be labeled a snitch, but after seeing those videos from the park, I can't stay quiet anymore." Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mayor Roberts called an emergency meeting with Chief Chen and the Police Commission. The large conference room buzzed with worried conversations about public trust and department image. "David," the mayor said, using the chief's first name, "this incident is all over social media. We need to show the public we're taking action." Chen placed a thick folder on the conference table. "With all due respect, Mayor, we need to do more than show. We need to actually change things." He opened the folder, revealing his newly drafted reform proposals. "This isn't just about Miller anymore." Back at the high school, Sarah sat in her literature class, trying to focus despite the whispers and stares from her classmates. Her teacher, Mr. Thompson, handled the situation with grace. "Today's lesson is about moral courage," he announced, holding up Sarah's favorite book. "About standing up to injustice, just like we've seen in our own community." During lunch break, students gathered around Sarah's table. Many shared their own stories of being profiled or harassed. Jessica, a Latino student, spoke about being followed in stores. Michael, a black student, described being stopped 3 times while jogging in his own neighborhood. At the police station, Detective Reeves discovered something even more disturbing. She rushed into Torres's office, holding a USB drive. "Captain, I found deleted dashcam footage from Miller's patrol car at his old precinct," she explained, flooding the drive into Torres's computer. "Someone tried to erase it, but our tech team recovered it." The footage showed multiple incidents of Miller's misconduct, aggressive stops, inappropriate comments, and clear bias in how he treated different citizens. Torres watched with growing concern, taking detailed notes. In the break room, officers discussed the case while getting coffee. The usual joking atmosphere was replaced by serious conversations about responsibility and change. "You know what's crazy?" Officer Rodriguez said to his colleagues. "If Miller hadn't messed with the chief's daughter, he might still be getting away with this stuff." "That's exactly why we need better oversight," replied Officer Chen, no relation to the chief. "We can't wait for someone important to be harassed before we take these complaints seriously." By late afternoon, Captain Torres had compiled enough evidence to present to the review board. The conference room walls were covered with timeline charts showing Miller's history of misconduct. Photos, statements, and recovered documents painted a clear picture of an officer who had abused his power repeatedly. Chief Chen reviewed the evidence himself, each new discovery strengthening his resolve to reform the department. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, my classmates want to know if they can attend the next community police meeting. They have stories to share." Chen smiled at his daughter's message. Even in the midst of this crisis, she was thinking about helping others. He looked at Torres's investigation board again, seeing not just evidence against one officer, but an opportunity to rebuild trust between police and community. The sun began to set on another busy day at the station, but the work was far from over. This investigation had opened doors that couldn't be closed again, revealing problems that could no longer be ignored. The high school auditorium was packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls for the emergency community meeting. Principal Harris had offered the space when he heard how many people wanted to attend. The usual monthly police community meetings that drew 30 people had now attracted over 300 concerned citizens. Sarah sat in the front row with her mother, watching her father stand at the podium. Behind him, a large screen showed the department's new proposed changes. The room buzzed with energy and purpose. "What happened in Central Park last week," Chief Chen began, his voice strong and clear, "was not an isolated incident. Today, we're here to listen to your stories and work together for real change." Students from Sarah's school lined up at the microphones placed in the aisles. Jessica Rodriguez, still wearing her soccer uniform, spoke first. "Last month, a store security guard followed me around for 30 minutes, she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I was just buying a birthday present for my mom. Nobody did anything to help." More stories followed. Michael Thompson described being stopped while jogging. Mrs. Wu talked about being told to go back where she came from by a traffic officer. Each story added another piece to the picture of daily discrimination that many community members faced. In the middle of the auditorium, Captain Torres sat taking notes. Next to her, Detective Reeves updated the department's new incident reporting app on her tablet. They had created it in response to the investigation, making it easier for citizens to report and track complaints. "We've already received 50 reports through the app," Reeves whispered to Torres. "People finally feel safe coming forward." Sarah's friend Emily stood up next. "I was there in the park that day," she said. "I filmed what happened to Sarah. But the really amazing thing was watching everyone stand up to help. That's what we need more of. People who won't stay silent." At the back of the auditorium, Maria Rodriguez had closed her bakery early to attend. She sat with other small business owners who had formed a new community watch group. They wore blue and white badges that read Community Guardians. "We're not here to police the police," Maria explained to a reporter. "We're here to build bridges, to make sure everyone feels safe in their own neighborhood." Chief Chen introduced the department's new initiatives: mandatory monthly community service for all officers, civilian oversight committees with real power, cultural sensitivity training designed by community members themselves, and body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman from the park, raised her hand. "That's all good," she said. "What about Officer Miller? What happened to him?" The room grew quiet. Chief Chen looked at his notes before responding. "Officer Miller's case has led to a full investigation of not just his actions, but the system that protected him. As of this morning, he has been terminated from the force. Additionally, 3 supervisors from his previous precinct are under investigation for hiding complaints." Sarah watched her father speaking, remembering how he had handled everything by the book, even when it involved his own daughter. She thought about Miller, about how one officer's actions had sparked this movement for change. Near the end of the meeting, a young officer named Martinez stepped up to the microphone. "I'm new to the force," she said. "I became a cop to help people. What happened in the park? That's not what policing should be. We need to do better. We will do better." The crowd applauded. Chief Chen smiled at the young officer's courage to speak up. On the screen behind him, the department's new slogan appeared: "Protect, serve, respect, everyone." As the meeting wound down, people gathered in small groups, exchanging contact information and making plans. Sarah's classmates organized a student advisory committee. Local business owners discussed hosting monthly community police dinners. Mrs. Wilson volunteered to share her stories at police training sessions. Outside the auditorium, the evening sky glowed orange and purple. Sarah watched people leaving, talking excitedly about changes and possibilities. What had started as one frightening afternoon in the park had grown into something much bigger. A community finding its voice, a department facing its flaws, and people working together for real change. Her father joined her and her mother. His tie loosened after the long meeting. "You okay?" he asked Sarah softly. She nodded, looking at the crowd of people still discussing plans for change. "Yeah, Dad, I think we all are going to be." 6 months had passed since the incident in Central Park. The morning sun shone brightly as Sarah Chen stood at a podium in front of City Hall. Behind her, a large banner read Youth Police Advisory Council, First Anniversary. More than 200 people had gathered for the event. "When Officer Miller approached me that day in the park," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident, "I was reading To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a book about justice, prejudice, and standing up for what's right. I never imagined I would live out those same themes in real life." In the front row, Chief Chen and his wife watched their daughter with pride. Next to them sat Captain Torres, who now headed the department's new Community Relations Division. The changes they had implemented were showing real results. "In the past 6 months," Sarah continued, "our youth council has worked with the police department to create new training programs. We've shared our stories, our fears, and our hopes, and the police have listened." Officer Jenny Martinez, recently promoted to sergeant, stood at the side of the stage. She now led the department's cultural sensitivity training program, using Sarah's case as a teaching example for new recruits. "Today, we're launching our new mentorship program," Sarah announced. 50 high school students will be paired with police officers who will guide them, learn from them, and build bridges between law enforcement and young people. In the audience, Maria Rodriguez wiped away tears. Her bakery had become a monthly meeting spot for community police coffee sessions. The Community Guardians program she helped start had spread to other neighborhoods, with over 500 members citywide. Sarah held up a familiar blue book. "Remember this book from the park? Well, now it's required reading for all new officers, because understanding different perspectives isn't just about rules and regulations. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone we meet." The changes hadn't always been easy. Some officers had resisted the new policies at first, but the results were clear. Complaints were down 60%, community trust was up, and more young people of color were applying to join the force. Former Officer Miller's case had led to bigger changes too. 3 other departments in nearby cities had adopted Chief Chen's reforms. The state was now considering making similar changes mandatory for all police departments. But the biggest change, Sarah said, looking at her classmates in the crowd, is that we're not afraid anymore. When we see something wrong, we speak up. When we see someone being harassed, we don't walk away. She gestured to the new police station across the street, where large windows had replaced the old tinted glass. Inside, civilians worked alongside officers in the complaint department. Every interview room had cameras that couldn't be turned off. Last week, Sarah continued. A new officer stopped a teenager in the park. But this time was different. The officer sat down, asked about the book the teen was reading, and shared her own story of growing up in the neighborhood. That's the change we wanted to see. Mrs. Wilson, now a regular speaker at police training sessions, nodded in approval. Her weekly park visits had turned into informal community gatherings where people of all backgrounds shared stories and built friendships. Chief Chen stepped up to join his daughter at the podium. 6 months ago, a terrible incident showed us what needed to change. Today, we're showing everyone how to make that change happen. Together, they unveiled a new plaque that would hang in the police academy. Justice sees no color. Service knows no boundaries. Respect builds bridges. The crowd applauded as Sarah hugged her father. Among them were students, officers, business owners, and community leaders, all part of the change they had built together. As the ceremony ended, Sarah returned to her favorite bench in Central Park. She opened her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. But this time she wasn't alone. A group of young cadets sat nearby, discussing community relations with local teenagers. The park looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but everything was different. Where there had been fear, there was now understanding. Where there had been silence, there were now voices speaking up for change. A new officer walked past Sarah's bench, smiled, and waved. Sarah waved back, remembering how a moment of injustice had led to a movement of hope. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting shadows that seemed lighter somehow, as if they too had learned to be less threatening.